The late afternoon sun beat down on the streets of Minneapolis, casting long shadows along the sidewalks. The city hummed with a low murmur of ordinary life, cars honking in traffic, distant laughter from children playing in yards, and the occasional street vendor calling out for customers. To most, it was just another day, but for George Floyd, it would become the day that changed history. George walked calmly toward a local convenience store, his posture relaxed but purposeful. Known to many in his neighborhood, he carried the quiet dignity of someone who had faced life's challenges and sought peace amid them. His friends knew him as gentle, a man who smiled easily, laughed warmly, and treated strangers with respect. He pushed open the glass door of the store, the bell jingling softly overhead, and greeted the cashier with a nod. There was a moment of mundane normalcy, the kind of scene that anyone could overlook as ordinary. But in that ordinary moment, tension began to gather unseen. Inside the store, a clerk's voice caught George's attention. He had a $20 bill in his hand, and the clerk squinted at it, hesitating. "This might be counterfeit," the cashier said, uncertainty creeping into his voice. George's brow furrowed, but he didn't argue. He simply handed over the bill and apologized for any confusion, his voice calm, almost apologetic. He had no idea that this small transaction would soon ignite a chain of events spiraling far beyond anyone's control. Outside the store, patrol cars turned the corner. Officers were responding to a report of a suspected counterfeit bill, a routine call that usually ended quietly. But as they approached, the tension in the air became almost tangible. The streets seemed to pause for a heartbeat, the ordinary city sounds fading into a kind of anxious silence. George noticed them as they stepped from their vehicles, their presence commanding the space, imposing authority without a word. The first officer approached George, his tone firm but measured. "Sir, can you step over here?" he requested. George complied, his movements slow, deliberate, and unthreatening. The bystanders, some walking dogs, some sitting on benches, paused to watch the unfolding scene. There was a strange duality in the air, ordinary life intersecting with imminent danger. What began as a routine encounter escalated subtly. Questions were asked, and George's responses, calm and cooperative, were met with skepticism. He raised his hand slightly, not in defiance, but in reassurance. Yet every movement, every hesitation, every gesture was scrutinized, interpreted as resistance. The atmosphere thickened with unspoken tension. Moments later, handcuffs appeared. George's eyes widened, not in anger, but in bewilderment. "I'm not resisting," he said, his voice steady, carrying an almost desperate calm. The officers ignored his words. The bystanders murmured among themselves, unease rippling through the small crowd that had begun to gather near the store's entrance. Someone fumbled with a smartphone, already recording, sensing that something was off, sensing that what was about to happen would matter far beyond this corner of Minneapolis. The officers tried to force George toward the squad car. He stumbled slightly, not from aggression, but from fear and confusion. His words filled the air. "I can't breathe. Please, I can't breathe." The first cries were quiet, pleading, almost drowned in the ordinary city noises. But for those watching, every word was a warning, a siren of impending tragedy. Then it happened. Derek Chauvin, one of the officers present, pressed his knee against George's neck. The act was deliberate, heavy, and unrelenting. Floyd's protests grew louder, more frantic. "Please, I can't breathe. Mom!" The crowd gasped, some shouting at the officers to stop, some frozen in disbelief, unable to comprehend the cruelty unfolding before their eyes. The tension was unbearable, a slow-motion horror that gripped the onlookers and through the lens of the recording smartphones gripped the world beyond. Minutes stretched into eternity. Each second was a struggle for breath, a struggle for life. George's face, twisted in pain and fear, became the central focus. His eyes darted from the ground to the faces of the crowd, searching for help, pleading for mercy, for humanity. His voice, strained and breaking, cut through the tension like a knife. "I can't breathe. I can't breathe." the words repeated, almost a mantra of desperation, etching themselves into the minds of everyone present. The crowd around him reacted differently. Some tried to reason with the officers, their voices rising in anger and fear. "He is not resisting. Stop." Others shouted into their phones, recording, their hands trembling. Some wept openly, holding their heads in disbelief. The street had become a stage for a tragedy that no one could stop, a public spectacle of life and death. Time felt distorted. Each heartbeat was amplified. George's struggle was met with silence from the officers, save for the mechanical execution of Dewey, a chilling contrast to the chaos around them. Paramedics arrived, rushing through the crowd, but access was delayed. Their efforts were stymied by the very act of law enforcement meant to protect life. Every gesture, every movement was imbued with high-stakes tension, the kind that makes the audience's chests tighten, the kind that makes viewers lean forward, unable to look away. Finally, George Floyd fell silent. The life had slipped from him, leaving a void where his presence had been. The crowd's cries of anguish filled the street, echoing off the nearby buildings. The smartphone cameras continued rolling, capturing the raw aftermath, the horror, the grief, the disbelief. That footage would later travel the world, igniting a firestorm of outrage, sparking conversations about justice, morality, and systemic failures. The ordinary afternoon had transformed into a historic tragedy. George Floyd, a man known for kindness and humility, had become the symbol of a nation's pain. The audience, having journeyed with him through those harrowing minutes, was left with the tension unresolved, the fear, the injustice, the questions of accountability lingering heavily in the air. In this part, the story balances suspense, emotional depth, and visual tension. The ordinary setting makes the tragedy relatable. George's humanity makes the stakes deeply personal, and the slow escalation keeps the audience engaged, desperate to see justice served. The street outside the convenience store had become a scene of chaos. The ordinary rhythm of the neighborhood, cars passing, children playing, people chatting, was replaced by sharp gasps, shouts, and the ringing of smartphones recording the unthinkable. George Floyd's lifeless body remained on the asphalt, pinned beneath the weight of an unyielding knee. Every onlooker felt the gravity of the moment, and in that shared tension, a collective heartbeat of outrage and helplessness began to form. Bystanders clustered closer, some frozen in shock, others moving instinctively to intervene. One young woman shouted, her voice trembling with fear and fury, "He's not resisting! You're killing him!" Another man, his phone in hand, whispered curses under his breath, recording the moment as if the world needed to see the truth. The camera angles captured more than the act itself. They captured humanity's raw reaction, grief, anger, and disbelief converging in a single frame. Paramedics arrived, their uniforms bright against the heat of the street. But the crowd had grown dense, pressing in from all sides, and the officers' inaction prevented immediate access. Tension spiked as the minutes ticked by. George's breathing was shallow and ragged. His voice, when it emerged, was barely audible above the cacophony of shouting witnesses. "I can't breathe. Please." Each word landed like a hammer blow to the chest of every witness. The bystanders' efforts escalated. A man stepped forward, waving his hands and pleading with the officers to lift the pressure from George's neck. A teenager shouted into a phone, live streaming the scene, "He's dying! Help him! Somebody, please!" Their desperation was mirrored in the gasps and murmurs rippling through the growing crowd. Each second felt eternal. Every gesture of intervention, ignored or dismissed, ratcheted the suspense higher. Voices overlapped, some rational, some hysterical. One elderly man shouted, "This is murder," while another whispered prayers under his breath. The audience feels the tension building as the street becomes a crucible of conflicting emotions: fear, rage, sorrow, and the unfiltered human instinct to act. George's eyes darted from face to face, searching, pleading, leaving witnesses and viewers alike with an intimate sense of his terror. Smartphones captured the smallest details, the quiver of his lips, the sweat glistening on his forehead, the tightening of his fingers against the asphalt. The video footage that would later circulate globally began here, raw and unedited, capturing the unvarnished truth of what had occurred. Each recording was a silent testimony, an artifact of injustice, amplifying the scene's emotional weight far beyond Minneapolis. Police radios crackled in the background, officers exchanging clipped, professional words. But in the heat of the street, their authority was under siege, both from the crowd and from the unflinching lens of social media. The tension between order and chaos was palpable. Every second that George remained pinned heightened the urgency, as if time itself were complicit in the unfolding tragedy. Paramedics finally approached, their stretchers and equipment at the ready, but access was still delayed by the officers' positioning. The tension in the scene was unbearable, cinematic in its intensity. Witnesses shouted directions, urging the officers to move. The air was thick with desperation, the raw soundscape of grief filling every frame. "Please, let him breathe," cried one voice, echoing in the concrete canyon of the city street. George's pleas persisted, faint and labored, but the inevitability of the situation became apparent. "I can't breathe. I can't." His voice faltered, weakening with every second. The camera captures not only his words, but the reactions of the crowd. Mothers covering their children's eyes, teenagers frozen mid-recording, older residents shaking their heads in disbelief. The tension is visceral, shared by all who witness, leaving viewers of the story holding their breath in unison with the street's inhabitants. Eventually, George went silent. The paramedics worked frantically, their hands pressing against his chest, their faces set with grim determination, yet no movement, no pulse, no response. The street fell into a heavy, choking stillness, broken only by cries of grief and sobs from those who had watched him struggle helplessly. The audience feels the weight of loss in each frame, the sudden transition from desperate hope to crushing finality. As word spread through the neighborhood, a crowd began forming beyond the immediate scene. Neighbors poured out of nearby buildings, drawn by sirens, shouting, and the ominous energy radiating from the store. Curiosity collided with fear and outrage. Phones were raised, live streams began, and social media buzzed with fragments of video footage. The incident, initially local and contained, started to take on global significance, amplified by every uploaded clip, every share, every desperate comment typed in anger or sorrow. News crews arrive, cameras flashing, microphones held toward witnesses. Reporters narrate what they see, attempting to make sense of chaos, translating raw emotion into words for a public thousands of miles away. Yet no words could fully capture the horror witnessed on that street. The audience feels the intensity, the intersection of human suffering and institutional power, the helplessness of bystanders, the horror of injustice unfolding before their eyes. Meanwhile, inside the police vehicles, officers exchanged terse glances, unaware or irresponsive to the storm building outside. The tension between procedure and morality becomes the invisible antagonist of the story. For viewers, the dissonance is almost unbearable, the cold, mechanical actions of authority versus the visceral human pleas, every heartbeat a drum of suspense. As the day fades, the consequences of the incident begin to ripple outward. Online, the first clips appear on social media, the hashtags begin to trend, and the digital audience swells into millions. The narrative is no longer constrained to a single street corner in Minneapolis. It spreads across the nation and the world, carrying with it outrage, grief, and the demand for justice. By the end of part 2, the audience is left with hearts pounding, minds racing, and emotions raw. The tragedy is personal and public simultaneously. George Floyd's death is not just witnessed, it is experienced. The suspense, the fear, the helplessness, and the immediacy of the horror ensure viewers are emotionally invested, eager to follow the next phase of the story: the protests, the national outcry, and the search for justice. The video of George Floyd's death traveled fast. At first, it was shared among Minneapolis residents, passed from phone to phone, text to text, social media platform to social media platform. But soon, the footage transcended neighborhoods, cities, and states. Across the nation, screens lit up with the same haunting image: a man pleading for his life, pinned beneath a police officer's knee, the words, "I can't breathe," echoing endlessly. For millions, it wasn't just a story, it was a visceral experience, impossible to ignore. Within hours, small gatherings began in Minneapolis. People came together, spontaneously, chanting George Floyd's name, demanding justice, demanding accountability. Mothers held their children close, their voices trembling with fear and fury, while teenagers carried handmade signs that read, "Justice for George" and "No more silence." The energy was electric, charged with grief and righteous anger. The audience feels the swell of emotion, the mounting tension, and the fragile hope that action might follow tragedy. The protests grew rapidly. By nightfall, the streets of Minneapolis were alive with movement, thousands marching, voices rising in unison, creating a chorus that demanded attention. Sirens wailed in the distance, police vehicles circled, and spotlights cut through the darkening sky. The narrative alternates between the macro and micro, the massive energy of the crowd, the individual stories of those who had lost faith in the system, and the officers observing the scene with wary calculation. Suspense builds as the stakes rise. Every shout, every chant, every confrontational gesture feels like it could tip the balance. Across the country, the story erupted into national consciousness. News outlets scrambled, broadcasting the footage repeatedly, dissecting every frame, interviewing witnesses, family members, and activists. Social media hashtags trended globally. Hashtag Justice for George Floyd, hashtag I Can't Breathe, hashtag Black Lives Matter. Ordinary citizens far removed from Minneapolis found themselves confronting their own understanding of systemic injustice. The story became more than a local tragedy. It was a mirror reflecting racial inequality, police brutality, and societal failure. The protests were not uniform in tone. Some remained peaceful, a human river moving through city streets with dignity and solidarity. Others escalated, clashing with law enforcement. Police cars rocked by thrown objects, windows shattered, tear gas rising in clouds of smoke. Cinematic tension surged. The audience feels the fear, exhilaration, and uncertainty of each scene, caught between hope for justice and the chaos of anger unleashed. Helicopters hovered overhead, sirens pierced the night, and the air vibrated with collective rage and grief. In Washington, D.C., demonstrators gathered outside government buildings, their voices amplified by speakers and media coverage. Lawmakers and public officials were forced into a reaction, issuing statements condemning Floyd's murder, promising investigations, yet the public remained wary. The story shows the friction between authority and populace, the slow tension of bureaucracy against the explosive energy of human outrage. It is a dance of power and morality, the stakes as high as life itself. Family members of George Floyd emerged into the media spotlight, their grief raw and public. Tears streaked down cheeks as they recounted George's life, his laughter, his kindness, his dreams, and his struggles. The audience sees their humanity, understands their loss, and feels the emotional resonance of every word. Activists joined them, channeling personal pain into collective action, adding layers of narrative tension, anger tempered by purpose, grief transformed into determination. The protests spread to cities across the United States: New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Atlanta, and beyond. Millions marched, carrying banners, lighting candles, and raising voices in unison. Streets transformed into rivers of people, each participant a living testament to outrage. News cameras broadcast the scenes globally. The narrative juxtaposes intimate moments: a young man kneeling in silent prayer, a mother holding her baby near a mural of Floyd, with the sweeping spectacle of mass mobilization. Suspense arises from the unpredictability of each moment. Peaceful protest could erupt into confrontation at any second. Law enforcement responses varied. In some cities, police attempted to maintain order with restraint. In others, clashes escalated. The audience is drawn into the tension of conflict, understanding both the human instinct for justice and the institutional reflex for control. Every interaction, officer and protester, media and public, citizen and citizen, adds layers of emotional complexity, making the audience empathize, fear, and hope simultaneously. As the days passed, the national conversation deepened. Experts appeared on news panels, analyzing systemic racism, policing practices, and the role of social media in shaping public perception. Commentary was passionate, scholarly, and emotional, adding context to the visceral scenes already witnessed. The audience feels both the intellectual weight of the story and the raw emotional pull of the visuals, ensuring engagement on multiple levels. Across cities, symbolic acts emerged. Murals of George Floyd appeared on walls, street corners were covered in chalk messages of solidarity, and musicians dedicated performances to his memory. These quieter moments offered emotional respite amid the chaos, but carried weight, an undercurrent of hope that systemic change could emerge from tragedy. Suspense remained, however, as the future of justice was uncertain, the next moments of tension waiting to unfold in courtrooms, legislation, and policy debates. By the end of this part, the nation was irrevocably changed. The protests, social media storm, and public discourse had created a movement, a palpable force that demanded recognition. The audience is left with a mix of exultation and tension, awestruck by the power of collective action, fearful of escalating conflict, and deeply invested in the pursuit of justice. George Floyd's death, witnessed and shared by millions, had become a catalyst for reflection, outrage, and hope. Part 3 closes with the story poised on the cusp of resolution. The stage is set for the legal proceedings, the quest for accountability, and the lasting legacy of a man whose death sparked a global reckoning. The audience, emotionally exhausted yet fully invested, waits to see whether justice will finally be served and what impact it will leave on a nation forever altered. The courtroom in Minneapolis was tense with anticipation, its walls echoing with the weight of history. For months, the world had watched, waited, and debated the meaning of George Floyd's death. Now, the stage was set for accountability. Inside, family members, lawyers, and journalists filled the seats, each aware that the eyes of millions were upon them. The air was thick, not just with the physical heat of the room, but with collective expectation and unresolved grief. Derek Chauvin entered the courtroom, his face unreadable, the weight of the charges pressing down on him. Murder, second-degree manslaughter, and third-degree murder, each count a legal testament to the tragedy that had sparked global outrage. George Floyd's family sat in the gallery, holding each other tightly. Their grief was still raw, but tempered now by the faint glimmer of hope that justice might finally be realized. For the audience, the tension was almost unbearable. Every movement, every glance, every whisper seemed amplified. The trial opened with testimony from witnesses who had been present on that fateful day. Bystanders' accounts were chilling, each retelling immersing the courtroom in the horror of those final minutes. "He was pleading for his life," one witness said, voice trembling. "I could hear him saying, 'I can't breathe,' and the officer didn't stop." The room seemed to contract under the weight of these words, the gravity of reality pressing down on everyone inside. For the audience, the suspense was both emotional and moral. Would the law recognize the full measure of the crime? Medical experts took the stand next. Their testimony was technical, yet every word carried devastating clarity. Autopsy reports, forensic analysis, and physiological explanations painted a portrait of the fatal strain imposed upon George Floyd. The jury listened intently, as did viewers around the world following live updates. Each detail reinforced the undeniable truth. George Floyd's life had been taken unlawfully, and every second of hesitation had contributed to the tragedy. The tension was no longer just moral, it was legal, procedural, and absolute. Defense attorneys argued their case, presenting their version of events and challenging aspects of the prosecution's narrative. Their voices were calm, measured, and at times chillingly detached. But the testimonies of witnesses, the videos captured by bystanders, and the expert analyses were overwhelming in their weight. The audience could feel the narrative tipping, the slow but inexorable pull of truth overpowering denial. Suspense shifted from "what happened" to "how will justice be served?" Days turned into weeks, each session of the trial intensifying public interest. Media coverage was relentless, capturing courtroom sketches, witness statements, and family reactions. Across the country, communities gathered outside courtrooms and on screens at home, holding vigils, discussing implications, and demanding resolution. The narrative tension was global. The story was no longer confined by geography. It had become a collective experience, shared across cities, states, and nations. Finally, the moment arrived. The jury returned to the courtroom after deliberation. Every person inside felt the weight of anticipation, the collective inhale before the inevitable exhale. Judge Peter Cahill read the verdict slowly, deliberately. Guilty on all counts. The words resonated, echoing through the courtroom and out into the streets. Relief, tears, and quiet sobs filled the room. George Floyd's family embraced, a mixture of sorrow and vindication washing over them. The audience experienced the tension release, yet it was bittersweet. Justice had been served, but the loss remained irrevocable. The verdict sparked celebrations and reflections simultaneously. Outside the courthouse, crowds erupted in cheers, some kneeling in silent prayer, others chanting for continued reform. Across cities, people took to streets, holding signs, lighting candles, and sharing stories. The tension of anticipation gave way to the emotional catharsis of justice realized, yet the story's deeper meaning lingered. Systemic change was still a work in progress. The audience, emotionally invested throughout, felt the resonance of both triumph and ongoing struggle. Beyond the courtroom, the story of George Floyd catalyzed tangible societal shifts. Policymakers and city officials faced renewed pressure to implement reforms in policing practices. Discussions on accountability, racial bias, and law enforcement protocols gained urgency. The narrative expanded from a single act of injustice to the broader movement for equity, human rights, and societal responsibility. The audience sees that George Floyd's death was not an isolated tragedy, it was a turning point, a mirror reflecting systemic issues demanding redress. Memorials for George Floyd sprang up across the nation. Murals adorned city walls, candles flickered in public squares, and gatherings commemorated his life. Artists, musicians, and writers paid tribute through their work, ensuring that his memory remained vivid in the cultural consciousness. These acts of remembrance allowed communities to process grief collectively, transforming tragedy into a shared journey toward hope and understanding. For the audience, these scenes provide emotional depth, contrasting the raw violence of Part 1 with the human resilience and unity of Part 4. Activists and ordinary citizens continued their work, inspired by George Floyd's story. Protests evolved into organized campaigns, advocacy groups grew in influence, and conversations about racial justice permeated schools, workplaces, and homes. The tension was now shifted from suspense to engagement. The audience was invited to consider their role in systemic change, to feel the moral imperative behind the narrative. The story closes on a reflective note. Images of George Floyd smiling, surrounded by friends and family, flash across screens. Candles burn in memorials, murals honor his life, and the voices of millions continue to call for justice. The audience is left with a profound sense of both loss and possibility. George Floyd's death sparked outrage, ignited movements, and left an indelible mark on the world, but it also highlighted humanity's capacity for empathy, resilience, and change. In conclusion, Part 4 ties the narrative threads together: the brutal tragedy, the emotional and social upheaval, the pursuit of justice, and the enduring legacy. Suspense resolves with the verdict, emotional stakes are honored through memorials and activism, and the audience is left with a sense of catharsis mixed with reflection, a story that is as sobering as it is inspiring.